Hi. So it's been a while since I saw you last, and a lot has happened since then. You would think that the coronavirus was enough of a story, but in addition to the coronavirus, we also have Turkey trying to bring the US into World War III against Russia, but more on that later. Let's talk about coronavirus first. I think at this point we have to assume that we're all going to get it. The good news is if you're young, it's probably not going to affect you more than a cold would, and you probably won't even realize you've had anything other than the normal cold. If you are older, your chances of dying increase dramatically, and I think if you're over 80, so far 18% of patients over 80 have died. The numbers seem to be that if you contract this virus, 1 out of 5 people is going to require hospitalization, and of those people, 1 out of 4 is going to require intensive care in the hospital. I happen to know that the US, as opposed to South Korea, which is conducting more than 10,000 tests every day, the US, as of yesterday or the day before, had only conducted 450 tests, and even more worrying, they are no longer telling us how many tests have been performed. You wonder what possible reason there could be to hide the number of tests being performed, and I will tell you that there are only 2 reasons to hide the number of tests. Number one, the number of tests being given is so great that it would horrify people, or the number of tests being given is so low that it would horrify people. In either case, you should be horrified that this number is no longer being released. However, back to the government and the response to coronavirus. The other point I'd like to mention is President Trump and his decision to appoint Mike Pence as the czar in charge of this health outbreak. You would think Health and Human Services possibly would be a better guy, but I know Trump doesn't like him, and so here we are with Mike Pence in control, which is fine. I'm all in favor of there being coordinated efforts, if you will. The problem is that the information we've been given is that all statements about the virus will have to be cleared through Pence, which means that if you're a CDC official or somebody else who works for the government, you're no longer allowed to state what you're seeing. You have to have it approved by the central authorities. A very worrying development, and certainly I don't really know what an appropriate response for a government is. On the one hand, you've got China, which even though we've been pointing the finger at them, by we I don't mean me and a group, I mean the world. The world has pointed to China and found their response to this virus to be lacking. And I would say that their response has been unbelievably proactive. I can't imagine the US actively quarantining cities, regions, states. I can't imagine the population of the US, what their reaction would be to involuntary quarantines. On the other hand, it's hard to believe that the US's policy of sticking its head in the sand is going to be a good one. When you look at the volume of travelers that arrive at the major international hubs like New York, Chicago, Miami, LA, San Francisco, Seattle as a tech center, Vancouver in Canada, you have to believe that thousands of infected people have moved through those airports in the last 30, 60 days. And at this point, I'd be shocked if there were less than several thousand, if not tens of thousands of infected people in the States. There's no way of proving or disproving that, but if there are a large number of infected people in the States, then very shortly we will see the hospital system overwhelmed. When you think about the fact that 20% of those infected are going to require hospitalization, and 1/4 of those will require an ICU bed. I mean, if you have 1 million people infected, that's 200,000 hospital beds and 50,000 intensive care beds. I don't really know what the facilities in the US are. As a comp, I've heard that in the UK, the number of beds available to treat acute respiratory distress, number 15. Not 15,000 or 1,500, 15. And the good news, that 15 can be increased to 30 in the case of an emergency. So I would expect the US to be better prepared than that, but possibly not by a significant margin. So it appears that we will find out that we have coronavirus or COVID-19, I think it's called now. We will find out we have it when the hospital systems become overwhelmed, because the government we have now is not going to give us any warning, and there's not going to be any way to determine the degree of risk that we face until it's too late. Prepare yourself, get some emergency supplies so that if you are forced to quarantine or decide to quarantine, you can live for 2 weeks, 4 weeks with at least food and water, even if you aren't enjoying the menu. Just a brief note on World War III before we leave. Turkey is basically attempting to control the northern part of Syria. They claim that terrorists are there and that they need to occupy Syria to protect Turkey. The problem is that Syria is an independent country and has invited Russia to protect it. So Syria and Russia have the only forces that are actually authorized to act within Syria. If Turkey acts, if the US acts, it's not with international law on their side. I will also point out Turkey just released a huge number of refugees onward to Greece in an effort to apply ever more pressure to the EU. For those who worry about Turkey dragging the US into World War III through the NATO commitments on mutual defense, I would point out that Article 5 does say that the US will come to the aid of Turkey, but only on Turkish soil. So theoretically, if Turkey is in Syria and suffers grievous military losses, even if Turkey declares war on Syria, I don't believe Article 5 commits us to fighting on Turkey's side, or even to do anything in Turkey's favor, as long as Turkey itself is not invaded. So despite the best efforts of those who work for military companies and the people in Congress who work for them, despite their best efforts, it looks as if war has been averted for now. Let us certainly hope so, because all we need now is a pandemic and a war, and I think we're just 5 short of the biblical, what were they? Biblical punishments, I guess we're going to have to go with, since I can't think of the actual word. And if you add locusts, we're almost halfway there. So be on your toes and pay attention. It's getting interesting out there. Take care.